There's something strange about football fans. When a club spends £20 million on a player, we ask, is he good enough? At £50 million, we ask the same thing. But when the number reaches £100 million, something changes. Suddenly, we're not watching a footballer anymore. We're watching a £100 million footballer. And every missed chance, every bad pass, every bad game starts looking more expensive. Because football doesn't just put a price on players, it puts expectations on them.
Let's start with a transfer that looked almost impossible to fail. Barcelona signed Antoine Griezmann from Atlético Madrid in 2019 for a deal reported at around £107 million. At the time, this wasn't some unknown prospect. This was Griezmann, World Cup winner, elite scorer, one of Atletico's biggest stars. So Barcelona wasn't buying potential, they were buying certainty. And that's exactly why the transfer became so fascinating. Because when you pay superstar money, being good isn't enough anymore. You're expected to change the team. And suddenly, every goal that doesn't arrive feels like evidence that the price was wrong.
Then came João Félix. Atlético Madrid paid Benfica around £113 million in 2019. Think about that for a second. Félix was only 19. That's what makes this transfer psychologically fascinating. You're not paying for what the player is. You're paying for what you believe he could become. And that's one of the biggest traps in football transfers. Potential is basically a blank check, because nobody can prove you wrong until the player actually has to live up to it.
Then Chelsea did something that would have sounded ridiculous a few years earlier. They spent up to £115 million on Moisés Caicedo, a defensive midfielder. And that's important, because football's biggest fees used to feel reserved for superstars whose names sold shirts. But Caicedo represented something different. Chelsea wasn't simply buying fame. They were buying control. They believed his age, ability, and potential justified the price.
And then Chelsea went even further. Just months after Enzo Fernández helped Argentina win the World Cup, Chelsea paid Benfica around £106.8 million. That's the power of momentum. One tournament can completely change how the world sees a player. Before the World Cup, promising midfielder. After the World Cup, £100 million midfielder. Same human being, completely different price tag. That's the psychology of football's transfer market. Sometimes you're not paying for the player, you're paying for the story surrounding the player.
Now we enter a completely different era. Liverpool spent a reported $116 million package on Florian Wirtz in 2025. And here's what makes it interesting. Wirtz wasn't a Ballon d'Or winner. He wasn't a global superstar like Neymar. Liverpool was betting on his future. They were effectively saying, we believe this player can become the center of our next era.
And then 2026 gave us something nobody expected. Elliot Anderson moved from Nottingham Forest to Manchester City for a reported £116 million. And suddenly, a player who wasn't previously a global superstar was sitting alongside some of football's biggest transfer fees ever. That's the new transfer market. Clubs are increasingly paying enormous amounts for age, athleticism, tactical fit, and the belief that a player can become the next great thing. And Anderson's story is especially interesting because he had joined Forest for a reported £35 million only 2 years earlier. His value had exploded.
And then Chelsea broke the British transfer record again. Morgan Rogers moved from Aston Villa for a reported £117 million, £1 million more than Anderson. And that tiny difference tells you something fascinating. At this level, £1 million can become history. Rogers became the most expensive British player ever. Not because someone suddenly became £1 million better overnight, because football prices are psychological. A number becomes a headline, the headline becomes pressure, and the pressure follows the player onto the pitch.
But Liverpool took the gamble even further. Alexander Isak moved from Newcastle for around £125 million, making him the most expensive Premier League signing. And this is where the transfer fee becomes almost unfair. Because now every goal is measured against £125 million. Every injury becomes a headline. Every quiet game becomes, was he worth it? That is the hidden cost of a record transfer.
Then we go back to 2017. PSG paid Monaco around £163 million for a teenager named Kylian Mbappé. And this wasn't just a transfer, it was a declaration. PSG weren't saying, we found a talented kid. They were saying, this kid is going to be one of the faces of world football. And they were right. That's what makes the transfer so fascinating. Sometimes a huge fee doesn't destroy a player's reputation. It becomes part of the story that made him a superstar. But then, football's entire financial reality changed. Neymar, Barcelona to PSG, €222 million.
The record still stands today, and this is why Neymar has to be number one. PSG didn't just pay more than anyone had ever paid before, they paid so much more that the old record suddenly looked ancient. And almost 9 years later, nobody has broken it. That's extraordinary. But here's the part I find more interesting. After Neymar, £100 million transfers stopped feeling impossible. The psychological ceiling had moved. Suddenly, clubs could imagine numbers that would have sounded ridiculous before. And that is Neymar's real legacy in the transfer market. He didn't just break the record. He changed what football believed a player could cost.
And that's why these transfers are more interesting than a simple list of expensive footballers. Because every number tells a story. Sometimes it's potential. Sometimes it's desperation. Sometimes it's ambition. Sometimes it's ego. And sometimes it's a club betting its entire future on one player. But there's one thing every transfer has in common. The moment that fee becomes official, the player is no longer judged only by his football. He's judged against the number. And maybe that's the strangest thing about modern football. We don't just put a price on players.
So now I want to know what you think. Which transfer was the biggest gamble? Neymar, Mbappé, Isak, Rogers, or one of the others? And don't just tell me which one was the most expensive. Tell me which fee created the most pressure, because that's a much harder question. And if you want football stories that go beyond the usual goals, trophies, and transfer rumors, subscribe. Next time, we're going to look at what happens when a footballer's £100 million price tag becomes a problem instead of a compliment. And honestly, some of those stories get ugly.